Hey folks, welcome to Patreon content. This is the first video I'm recording for bonus content, Patreon subscriber content for the Daniel Otto Jack Peterson YouTube channel, where I host the Hole on the Corner, where we talk all things R.A. Lafferty, that series, and I'm actually gonna start one more series for that channel that's gonna be about music, and I'll announce that later, but might as well mention it here. This Patreon stuff is for anybody that subscribes that may come over from anything I'm doing on YouTube. So one of the things I'm gonna do, I'm calling Forgotten Bookshelf, where I just semi-randomly grab a book off the shelf and talk about that author for a bit. And you know, it'll be a little more thick, I guess, with content than that sounds, just because one, I'm going to pick things that, you know, I care about, and that even if I haven't read them for a long time, I have some strong impression about and something to say about. So, you know, it's going to be meaningful chat. And also I'll take a little look at the books and kind of remind myself of some bits and stuff. So I think it'll be fun discussions, hopefully, and stuff that can generate comments from you guys where you can say, oh, here's what I think about that author, or here's what I think you got wrong or right, or what have you. And I also want to say that if you see the little shot of me going along the bookshelf, and I'll do different shots of the bookshelf, and you see something in there you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I will try to include that sooner rather than later in content here. But I need, you know, knowing that anybody wants anything out there obviously gives me motivation to get to that sooner than other things. Anyway, in this episode of Forgotten Bookshelf, we're gonna talk about Lord Dunsany. So I come to Lord Dunsany, like a lot of people do, I imagine, through H.P. Lovecraft. How fun are these covers? How silly. I used to kind of hate them when I first got them. They were just the cheapest ones I could find, and now I kind of love them. And the third volume in that, which I'd totally forgotten that I used to, some of my scarier covers I would, because I really didn't care about. Now I wish I hadn't done this, but I stuck a piece of black duct tape over it. I think this creature is maybe eating someone here, and it was just really gruesome, and I was always scared my kids would see one of these things, because I let them just have access to my bookshelves, play around with them. They would often pull all the books off and stuff like that. And there were one or two things where the kids were like, oh, that's scary, you know, so anyway. But you come to, I think readers tend to come to Dunsany through Tolkien or Lovecraft, who cite him as an important influence. And I had heard of him through Dunsany. I'm not the hugest Tolkien fan. I recognize Lord of the Rings as an absolute masterwork and have read it several times, and it moves me actually deeply. It's just not my favorite kind of thing per se. And Lovecraft is not a favorite writer of mine. He's just a super important writer, does some very important things in his way, despite his obvious problems and problematics. But Lovecraft is of great interest to me. So reading him, you get into his sources. And I gotta say, you know, the people he talks about that were around, that were doing stuff at the same time as him and were his friends, such as Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. Awesome cover. So far, you know, I've still not gone deep enough into these guys, but from the, you know, half a dozen or so stories of each that I've read, I haven't been massively grabbed by them. And people really swear by Clark Ashton Smith, but I don't see it yet. But I'm definitely excited to explore more of these, and I think I will get more out of them. And even though Lovecraft can be, in my opinion, a pretty bad writer at times, though he has his moments, he could do some good stuff too, but you know, he's quite hit and miss that way. But he's just got a vision. He's doing something really special that, you know, has shaped the literary world for a reason. You know, there's something there. Anyway, through him, you get into his sources from just a little while before. Lovecraft is writing roughly 1920s to 1940s, and so are his, you know, contemporaries. And the people he's drawing on are really from just a little bit before the 1910s to 1920s-ish. So there's even some overlap there. But, you know, people like William Hope Hodgson and Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen, as well as Dunsany. As I thought about this, I can actually easily, at least for the time being, from my memory of reading all these guys, I can easily rank them. For me, at the lowest end would be Hodgson, who has just some amazing inventiveness, but I think his writing is probably the weakest of them. Then for me probably comes Blackwood, who I need to read a lot more of, and I'm very impressed with it. I really love what he's doing. It's really cool and kind of experimental in its way, and it is actually good writing. I just, for the time being, I'm not sure it's as good as the other guys. I would actually bring Lord Dunsany next in this group. He's even better, and then Machen is the top for me with these roots. I may revisit that. You know, they all are good writers, but with pretty strong weaknesses. And I'm not sure that I would call any of them sort of first-rate writers, like in terms of prose, craftsmanship, right? Though they all have their moments and they all do really special things, like at the sentence and the word level. It's really good. It's just kind of uneven, I think, to me. But in terms of overall literary scope, to me, Machen strikes me as the most literary of the group. That said, what's interesting to me is that I think Lord Dunsany, for me, is perhaps the most original of the group. And they're all inventive and original. I mean, it's just amazing that they were writing weird fiction and or horror or dark fantasy before it was even in its inception as the modern thing that we know it. It's in its inception with Lovecraft and his peers, and then after that comes what we think of as like modern horror, you know, or weird fiction or whatever. And these kind of are almost proto that. But they are properly weird fiction too. So it's amazing that these guys were, at least in terms of like 19th century and onward, were like, you know, pioneering the way in that kind of stuff. So let's chat a little about Lord Dunsany, and I'm just going to talk about these two books. I have one more. First, let's talk about this lovely Penguin edition of In the Land of Time and Other Fantasy Tales, edited by the indefatigable S.T. Joshi, who is a great guide to all these authors. He seems to be the guy who's doing all the forwards and all the notes. Really good stuff to kind of orient you, good scholarship. That said, I don't always agree with Joshi's interpretations of these authors. I think he gets a lot right, and I think he gets some general broad strokes right, and sometimes some details right. But he almost seems like he's the final word on it, because he's the guy in charge. He's editing everything, you know, and doing these extensive footnotes and whatever. But he's not the final word on these authors, and not on Lovecraft either, even though that's his main guy. But I appreciate his work. I'm so glad it's there for me to like jump into and get some historical context. And he's worked hard, no doubt about it. I mean, super hard. He has like a awesome bibliography. So kudos to Joshi. I'm just saying he's not sacrosanct, nor is any critic or editor. So this has a cool cover that I like a lot. And it was from around the time, according to the back cover, a painting from 1906 by Sidney H. Syme. And that's the thing that occurred to me as I was looking back over this and thinking about this, that, you know, to us, this is like this fantastical stuff, and maybe that evokes sort of a look backwards for us as modern readers. And it is, to a certain extent. I mean, that's definitely, it's about like looking to past romances and fantastical adventures and worldviews and things, for sure. But they were part of a whole kind of movement that, I think, as I understand it, this is not my area of academia, so if you happen to be an academic of any of this kind of stuff, please, you know, jump in, give me some comments, you know, and let me know more about this. But my impression is that this grows out of Romanticism, and in the turn of the century, there's artists, you know, painters and other people and writers and so on, all kind of engaging this like look at the fantastical, and maybe going into pagan roots and pre-Christian things and stuff, and saying, what can we do with that now? And it was like more of a cutting edge movement, and it made me think like, oh, you know what this is like? This is kind of like in the 60s, in the sort of late 60s and really even into the 70s, with like folk rock and prog rock and that kind of thing, where, you know, these were people in the counterculture and on the edge of culture and working for liberative politics and these kinds of things, but who were looking backwards for these resources and going, oh man, you know, let's talk about elves and dwarves, let's all read Tolkien and whatever, you know, and bring that into our lyrics and stuff. So, you know, that's kind of what was going on with people like Dunsany and maybe to an extent Mackin and the others. But he's an Irish author, and so I think there's something of his Irish roots coming into this, though he is inventive and kind of doing his own thing, not like sort of trying to retell Irish folklore or something like that for the most part, although I think that comes in its way. So in this collection, what you get is his first, as I understand it, his first 2 books that he put out, and then a whole bunch of selections of his short stories from across the years. And these first 2 collections, they're called Pagania and Environs. That's one book, and the other is Tales of Wonder. And in the first book, you get this proper mythology. It's like theogony. Here's the gods. Here's the making of the gods, and through them, the making of the universe. And then in the second book, you get sort of a little more down-to-earth mythology that's just downriver from that. So it's like you're in the highest levels of mythology with that first book, and then you're just a tier down from that in the second book. And then from there, you kind of go in, after those books, and you get into some of the short stories, you get into just like, okay, here's fantasy literature that has all that kind of mythology in the background, but it's, you know, you're really down into the sword and sorcery or whatever. But initially, you just get this epic mythology. Now I say epic because of its scope. It's actually that first book, which is the most mythological, Pagania and Environs, is around 80 pages long. So it's not a long work. And it's broken into all these tiny little sections. Like, you know, it's got a preface that's like a sentence, a prologue that's like a paragraph, and then the gods of Pagania, which is like half a page, and then of Scarl the drummer, which is a page, and of the making of the worlds, which is a page and a half, of the game of the gods, another page, you know, etc., etc. And these things that if you look through the titles, you're like, I wonder what this is all about. Just like the sayings of Kib, bracket, sender of life in all the worlds, or concerning Sish, brackets, the destroyer of hours, or the sayings of Slid, brackets, whose soul is by the sea, and so on. And each of these is like a half a page to a page and a half long. So it is a bit like Tolkien's Silmarillion, which a lot of people bounce off of, which I did to some degree. Actually, I only read, you know, first chapter or 2 or something, and actually quite enjoyed it myself. But I don't know, I wasn't in the right space to read it, and I never have gone back to it. I might one day, I don't know. But this has the virtue of just being so perspicuous in that the whole work is short, and then each of the little sections is so short. And it's really well done artistically in the sense that it slowly builds up the mythology. You get the introduction of this god behind the gods, and then this god of this and this god of that, until as it goes on, it can start referencing back just by one word to all these things that have been set up. And here's what I remember of it. I remember one being like, I was a little unsure how much I even wanted to try Dunsany. I had read some of the sort of fantasy short stories, especially the famous one, The Sword of Welleran, and I understood its appeal and its influence, but it just didn't massively grab me. And reading like sort of a whole, like, I love mythology, but I wasn't sure how much I wanted to read somebody's invented mythology from a writer I wasn't too sure about. So my first impression was just, I was so pleasantly surprised. I was like, this is a pleasure to read. I am enjoying this. Number 2 is that I was blown away at how powerfully nihilistic this was. This is the real deal. This is the stuff. And you can see its influence on Lovecraft in that way. And what's really cool, right, is that he achieves what Lovecraft achieves through a completely different medium, in a sense. Okay, Lovecraft is, you know, cosmic horror, and it's all this reference to the cosmos and the stars, and these elder gods who are monsters of various sorts, and our calamitous intersection with them. Dunsany also has elder gods and a completely cosmic scope, but at a purely mythological level, no science, no reference to science, etc., etc. But it gives you that feeling, I'd have to say way better than Lovecraft does, of being dwarfed by the sheer scope of the cosmos, of its size and of time, its duration, right? So like the game of the gods in this is going on for millions of years, read in our times billions of years, before they even make the humans, you know, and other various things that just keep giving you this scope of time. Really cool, both backwards and forwards. And he keeps talking about the rim of the world, capital R. And every time he just says the rim, I get this like, it's so cosmically, no, it's existentially vertiginous. It's really good. The prose, as I've said, kind of goes in and out for me. It tries to use this really elevated, older diction. It's trying to sound like old mythology and trying to sound biblical, I think, or what we imagine is biblical. A lot of times people say, I was recently having this discussion about Cormac McCarthy. People say, well, it's biblical. What do you mean by that? Have you ever read the Bible? It is so diverse. It has so many different styles going on. And the thing that elevated language we're thinking of with the Bible, when we say something's biblical, number one, we're thinking of the King James translation, which is its own work of art, and it's great, but it's not really necessarily what like the Hebrew or the Greek sounds like. And also the elevated language, in my memory of reading the Bible, I used to read it like a lot, like over and over. The elevated language of the Bible mostly comes from things like the prophets or maybe the Psalms, but where people are expressing themselves in these like self-consciously poetic terms. And then the syntax and the imagery and stuff gets, you know, eloquent and ornate. Whereas the prose describing events in the Bible tends to be incredibly simplistic. Not simplistic, incredibly economical. So, you know, when you say something sounds biblical, what exactly are you referencing? Anyway, let's sample a little bit of this. One of the amazing things about Dunsany is that within the context of this cosmic nihilism, there is some of the most intense poignancy I have ever read in literature, in imaginative literature especially. And it's strange because he has this convergence with writers like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in that way, that talk about the longing for things beyond that comes from engagement with fairy tale, basically. And that is in Dunsany in spades, within a different worldview than writers like Lewis and Tolkien had. So in this section, the sayings of Limpang Tung, brackets, the god of mirth and of melodious minstrels. It says that Limpang Tung said that he's looking at the work of the other gods and he basically finds them capricious. He says that the gods play with a strange scheme. And this is his response to that. I will send jests into the world and a little mirth. And while death seems to thee as far away as the purple rim of hills, or sorrow as far off as rain in the blue days of summer, then pray to Limpang Tung. But when thou growest old, or ere thou diest, pray not to Limpang Tung, for thou becomest part of a scheme that he doth not understand. So he says, you know, pray to me while you're feeling good and life seems vibrant, but when it goes beyond that and into death and calamity and so on, I can't help you. I don't understand what these other gods are doing. I just think that is so cool and interesting. And he talks about how, though between Pagania and the earth flutter 10,000 prayers that beat their wings against the face of death, never for one of them hath the hand of the striker been stayed, nor yet have tarried the feet of the relentless one. You know, so you get the vibe. I mean, this is doom metal fantasy, straight up, man. And there are these short sections that kind of outline who a god is, and then there will be like little, almost tales. The tales really come in the next book, but like a little bit more of narrative about something these gods are doing, and a lot of it, of course, is waging wars with each other or having some conflict or another with one another, or indeed creative processes, making humans or whatever. But in the almost endless litany of gods, they come down to this place of talking about home gods, like gods of the hearth. There are 1,000 home gods, the little gods that sit before the hearth and mind the fire. And then it names a handful of them. And let me just read you one. And Jabim is the Lord of broken things, who sitteth behind the house to lament the things that are cast away. And there he sitteth, lamenting the broken things until the worlds be ended, or until someone cometh to mend the broken things. Or sometimes he sitteth by the river's edge to lament the forgotten things that drift upon it. A kindly God is Jabim, whose heart is sore if anything be lost. And so there again you have that, just that gentle sense of poignancy and longing and elegiac, elegy in regard to the fragility and vagaries of life, of existence. And this wistfulness, like, would that there were something that could be done about this. And as we'll see, this whole idea of like broken things and forgotten things comes back in some of the short stories, completely unrelated, at least overtly unrelated to this mythology. And it shows me that there's something in Dunsany's heart about this kind of stuff. And it's something we'll see again and again, that he has this thing about vast scope and very intimate scope. Now, Dunsany, I would say, unlike the other three roots of Lovecraft, Blackwood, Machen, and Hodgson, Dunsany is not straight up horror. These guys, this is horror and or weird fiction. Dunsany, however, is dark fantasy. And as I've said, that comes through a lot in just the sheer doom and gloom of the worldview and the language and the scope and things. But there are some creepy moments in the mythology, and I couldn't find some images I thought I remembered. So I'll have to do a thorough reread to find some of this stuff. But I found one thing. And Dunsany's amazing the way he just ranges around between the beautiful and the not horrific, but bleak, I guess. I mean, it's not like the bleak can be beautiful. So he does tend to be beautifully bleak, but also a different kind of beauty that's not necessarily bleak. That's just, well, he's quite ecological, to be honest. And his feelings toward Faerie, well, frankly, exactly like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and probably a lot of other fantasists, is massively tied to the more than human world. So there's this section called Of the Thing That Is Neither God Nor Beast. There's a lot of stuff about deserts and desert-dwelling people in here to kind of give the feel that he's looking for. It works pretty good. And there's this moment where this prophet called Yadin tries to say a prayer in the desert to someone called Hudrazai. And down the wind his prayer went calling, why do the gods endure and play their game with men? Why doth not Skarl forsake his drumming, and Manya cease to rest? And the echo of the seven deserts answered, who knows? Who knows? And Skarl's drumming is kind of part of what keeps Manya asleep, I think. And Manya is the one who started this whole thing going and created all the other gods and stuff. But he's sleeping, and I think the lore is that when he finally wakes, the universe will cease to exist. And so this prayer is like, why is it going on? Can't we just stop with this? A nihilistic prayer. But it says like out of the waste of the desert, his prayer was heard. And it says, and from the rim of the waste whither had gone his prayer came 3 flamingos flying, and their voices said, going south at every stroke of their wings. But as they passed by the prophet, they seemed so cool and free, and the desert so blinding and hot that he stretched up his arms towards them. Then it seemed happy to fly and pleasant to follow behind, great white wings. And he was with the 3 flamingos up in the cool above the desert, and their voices cried before him, going south, and the desert below him mumbled, who knows, Who knows? Man, and he just has these little psychedelic trips amid the nihilistic mythologizing. But it briefly describes them going over the landscapes, the mountains and the rivers and so on, and they're going south, until they go south off the earth, past the moon, out into the stars. So they're like going cosmic south, until apparently they reach north again, north and beyond. There is only north where lie the worlds, and beyond it where lies the silence, capital S. And the rim, capital R, is a mass of rocks that were never used by the gods when they made the world, and on it sat Trogul, Trogool. Love that, out past the rim to these rocks, these primordial rocks that were never used, building blocks of creation, and then this entity called Trogul. And the T here, the T in thing here is capitalized. The word it is all caps, capital I, capital T, and the end is all caps. So it says, Trogul is the thing that is neither God nor beast, who neither howls nor breathes, only it turns over the leaves of a great book, black and white, forever, until the end. And all that is to be is written in the book, as also all that was. When it turneth a black page, it is night, and when it turneth a white page, it is day. Because it is written that there are gods, there are the gods. Also there is writing about thee and me, until the page where our names no more are written. And it kind of goes on like that for a bit. But there again, you're getting that cosmic scope that's kind of diminishing us. And it says that Trogul just turns these pages and never answers prayers. But this prophet tries to pray to Trogul and basically says, look, could you turn back time? If you do so, we'll create like a cult to Trogul and worship you. And Trogul's like, no, it doesn't work like that. Or as he says, though the whirlwind of the south should tug with his claws at a page that hath been turned, yet shall he not be able ever to turn it back. And I think that's a good example of the kind of this kind of syntax that is trying too hard, I think. Sometimes it works better than others. And certainly I love some of the language of the claws tugging and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think he's a little in his way here, trying to, and I think he will maintain a certain elevated type of speech throughout his career, but I do think he gets a tighter rein on it as he goes on as a writer. And he wakes up back in the desert after this cosmic journey, and the narration kind of confirms that indeed there sitteth somewhere a thing that is called Trogul, that is neither God nor beast, that turneth the leaves of a book, black and white, until he come to the words, My Dun Izan, which means the end forever, and book and gods and worlds shall be no more. Good stuff. Quick note on Lafferty, this idea of like the end of things, the ultimate end of things, so that all that was is no more, is the worldview that Lafferty is, frankly, combating, particularly in Past Master. And there's this entity, mysterious entity called Udin, the nothingness monster, who is also called a god and a god of nothingness, and these kinds of things. And his servants, the mechanical men and so on, their scheme is to lead us all through utopia back into unconsciousness and the whole universe into non-existence. And as they say in the story, and Lafferty uses this phrase in some other places too, to go all the way down inside the hole and then pull the hole in after us, which is a very tall tale type of way to say that, to get you to kind of picture something impossible to picture, but it is effective. And, why not just leave the nihilists alone, Lafferty? Well, because he thinks somehow they're having a huge influence on culture in America in the 20th century and elsewhere, and he's just fucking against it. He's just against it. He's not having it. And the thing about this is, let me just say, okay, whether you agree with a worldview like Dunsany's, or you agree with a worldview like Lafferty's, or you're on a spectrum somewhere in between, as I probably am. Great writers, it's not about just what they believe, it's about how they evoke it and convey it. And if they do it well, it is enriching to read it. Because one, it creates beauty that has its own kind of nourishment, no matter what the worldview is. And because of that, it does two awesome things. One, it gets you to think differently. It gets you to just really put yourself into a worldview and feel its possible merits. Also, if it's done well enough, it has the seeds of its own counterpoints contained within it, as I think Dunsany does with his, frankly, some kind of longing for transcendence or something. I don't know. And Lafferty, for his part, staunch Catholic that he is, has this narrative need to complicate things to a kaleidoscopic degree that makes it a genuine conversation about what could be the truth here. And he has what he thinks is the truth, and that comes into it. But it's so, like the critics talk about, Mikhail Bakhtin and stuff, novels are dialogic and multivocal, multivalent, that novels are heteroglossia. There's just many voices going on in novels as a form. And some novelists bring this out more than others. I think Lafferty and Cormac McCarthy are two of the greatest at doing this. Gene Wolfe also, but to me a little lesser with Gene Wolfe. And that may sound surprising because he might seem like the master of that kind of thing, but I think Lafferty and McCarthy take it a little further, whatever. But, rich writing can convey a worldview strong enough for you to experience it and go, maybe. But also convey it strong enough to really put it out there as also itself saying, maybe, So that's what I think great writing does, and I think you find that here in Dunsany. But I just thought it was worth mentioning that this kind of rich, proper, nihilistic worldview is what Lafferty is taking on, particularly in Past Master, and we're going to talk about this in the Past Master videos, which will be available to everyone. And there's ways in which I think Lafferty, as we'll see as I go through it, I think doesn't entirely give this worldview a fair shake, but in a clever way. And also, though, he, in some ways, I think, is trying to take it to a logical conclusion that purveyors of it are not always willing to go. Even though, most purveyors of nihilism are pretty gung-ho about it and it's all going to end, bleakness. Lafferty, really tries to push that and then say, so onward with Dunsany. Basically, in those first two books, just kind of having semi-psychedelic adventures in a nihilistic cosmos, which, for some people that's going to be oh, yes, please, sign me up. And I understand the appeal of that, believe me. And I love movies like that and stuff. But as I said, it goes into this next section where you get kind of stories that are, many consider sort of the roots of sword and sorcery or modern heroic fantasy, high fantasy type stuff. Generally speaking, Dunsany writes in a style that is not like modern fantasy. It remains in the realm of myth, folklore, fairy tale in its sentence structure. We'll get to a section where he goes beyond that, but when he's writing fantasy, it has more of that kind of language. And I've talked about Alzabo Soup, the Gene Wolfe podcast, before in talking about Snuffles, R.A. Lafferty's story, Snuffles. And they do an episode on Lord Dunsany and some of his short stories. It's really good, and it's some ones I had never read, and they sound amazing. And I've noticed that through some other sources too, that there's still a lot of amazing Dunsany stories out there that aren't even collected in this. But they point out a very interesting similarity. They didn't mention it as a similarity with Lafferty, but I'm noticing it as that. In that Dunsany is another one of these writers that just doesn't follow the conventions of modern fiction writing in terms of building characters, a world building, setting and stuff. He writes in a more compact style that puts something in place and then it sets there as this token, and it really works. and he's able to do a lot in a short space. But it does have a different quality then. It's going to have a more dreamlike quality, or almost like a reverie. So just a quick dip into some of these fantasy stories. There's The Sword of Welleran, the famous one. I'm not going to talk about that. I've never totally loved that story. I see the merit of it, and I see how it sets up a lot of high fantasy. And it's, Dunsany is a lot about being ornate, kings and kingdoms and opulence, and then fantastical opulence, of places and phenomena and beings or whatever. And he's good at it, but I don't always feel that he's great at it. I think I tend to like him when he's doing other kinds of things, and basically almost more down and dirty, creepy, or strange type of stuff. So in this story, the kith of the elf folk, there's this cathedral that's been on the edge of them, or this community that's been on the edge of a marsh for 8 centuries, it says, and they've built a cathedral there. And then it talks about these wild things, capital W, capital T. But from the deep and perilous places, edged with bright mosses, the wild things came leaping up to dance on the reflection of the stars, and over their heads as they danced, the marsh lights rose and fell. The wild things are somewhat human in appearance, only all brown of skin and barely 2 feet high. Their ears are pointed like the squirrels, only far larger, and they leap to prodigious heights. They live all day under deep pools in the loneliest marshes, but at night they come up and dance. Each wild thing has over its head a marsh light, which moves as the wild thing moves. They have no souls and cannot die, and are the kith of the elf folk. Hence the title. But what are those? There's some kind of fairy, goblin, brownie, gnome type thing. But I like the little details about the squirrel's ears and these marsh lights that move around with them. That is cool. Presumably that's somewhere else in fairy tale and lore. I don't seem to recall running into anything like that. Whether it's Dunsany's invention or his reminder to us that such lore exists, I love picturing that, and I'm glad that's in my head. Now, I'd like to see that represented somewhere. I'd love to see that in a movie or something. And so I didn't look into this story. I'm not sure what it's about, but it gives you an idea of some of the kind of stuff you can expect. And you can feel some of it from, pardon me, the titles, The Sword of Welleran, The Fortress Unvanquishable Save for Saknoth. And I think that's one of his more famous ones, and I didn't get into it. I can't quite remember what it's about. I looked at it, and it looks like, again, one of these really ornate ones. It looks a little more interesting to me. But then in the midst of these, you get to the kind of stuff I really like. And this one, the next section is called Prose Poems. And it's one of my favorite sections. And I felt like this belonged there. I don't know why it's here in the midst of these sort of semi-high fantasy stories or whatever. It's called Blagdaros. So it opens talking about how in this town at twilight, all the outcast things that are silent by day found voices. Already cool. Next words. An old cork spoke first. I'm in, man. Inanimate objects talking. This is very Laffertian as well. That was one of the things I remember years ago when I read this. I was like, whoa, this is like a Lafferty story. Listen to what the cork says. I grew up in Andalusian woods, but never listened to the idle songs of Spain. I only grew strong in the sunlight, waiting for my destiny. And what's his destiny? These merchants come along, harvest him, put him in the shape of a cork, and he stoppers a wine bottle. And he considers this like this great honor to be a guardian, he says, of this wine as it matures. They set me as a guard over the bubbling wine, and I faithfully stood sentinel for 20 years. And it says the wine was in the bottle, sleeping, dreaming of its future time in Provence, and it grew stronger and stronger. And the cork says, but when I had powerfully held him for 20 years, they brought him to the banquet and took me from my post. And the wine arose, rejoicing, and leapt through the veins of men, and exalted their souls within them, till they stood up in their places and sang Provencal songs. But me they cast away, me that had been sentinel for 20 years, and was still as strong and staunch as when first I went on guard. Now I am an outcast in a cold northern city, who once have known the Andalusian skies, and guarded long ago Provencal suns that swam in the heart of the rejoicing wine. good stuff. So it's just what a cool way into like a little material processes history. I mean, that's imagination, man. That is good. That's like, and it's a micro tale. You can just pull that one out all by itself and look at it. Very next thing, an unstruck match that somebody had dropped spoke next. Yes! I love this kind of stuff. And I love that it's like a used cork, and then not a spent match, an unstruck match. Really cool. And then the objects kind of range around. Sometimes they tell this, you know, they get into a background type of thing. And other times they just kind of hold forth on what they are and what they do. And this match boasts of how it's a child of the sun and an enemy of cities and stuff like that. And an old broken kettle speaks. A piece of an old cord. And then that gets into a big background story. And then it's, you know, it's like over. Oh, and it says they spoke among themselves, but all the while there loomed above them the form of an old rocking horse, complaining bitterly. He said, I am Blagdaros. Woe is me that I should lie now an outcast among these worthy but little people. So there's the title, Blagdaros. And then the rocking horse tells his tale and it kind of gets into a background. And basically he lets out this eloquent litany of the battles and journeys that he's been on with the Great One who rode him, fighting dragons and all these different things, until my master began to grow larger in his body and smaller in his soul, and then he rode more seldom upon quests. So he's a little boy's rocking horse, and he's still elevated with the little boy's imagination, and now he's cast off. And now remember that god, Jabim, who feels bad. You know, he's just a god out there feeling bad for lost and broken things. And here's the lost and broken things. That's a scope of imagination. That's beautiful. This is some of the best stuff I've ever read or experienced at that imaginative level. Whatever the craftsmanship or anything else, this is just incredible. But going back to the gigantesque that Dunsany evokes just as well as he evokes the small. There's a story called Idle Days of Yann that is about the river Yann. And in this story and in a lot of Dunsany, there's so much personified sort of forces of nature and stuff like that. And this river Yann that these human characters are sailing on in a boat, in a vessel. The river gets excited as they near this place called the Hills of Gorm and sort of starts leaping toward it, carrying them along. And it says that the reason Yann, the river, is excited about the Hills of Gorm is because that's where the river is going to see the merry, wild Irillion rejoicing from fields of snow. So this Irillion figure that Yann, the river, wants to see. And so they go from this main riverway into this ravine in the mountains. And it says, a great shadow brooded between the cliffs of Glorm, but the crags were shining above us like gnarled moons, and almost lit the gloom. Louder and louder came the Irillion's song, and the sound of her dancing down from the fields of snow. And soon we saw her white and full of mists, and wreathed with rainbows delicate and small, that she had plucked up near the mountain's summit from some celestial garden of the sun. Then she went away seawards with the huge grey Yann, and the river widened and opened upon the world, and our rocking ship came through to the light of the day. So I just love that image of, I don't know, the Irillion is this mist maybe, plucking up rainbows from a garden of the sun. I love that kind of gigantism, sort of sudden gigantism. And you get a lot of that in Lafferty, in a very different sort of diction usually. Well, no, not entirely different. Lafferty actually, talk about some skill and stuff, he mixes kind of that high eloquence with a much earthier tone. And whoever put this collection together really nailed it, man. It is I've talked before about putting together short story collections and how there's an art to it, and it's like making a mixtape, and the way you arrange stuff really makes a difference. And so far, nobody seems to understand me. But anyway, part of it is just chronological, starting with those early collections and moving onward. But there's a certain point at which they just have to start selecting stuff. And they've set it up to where you, as I've said, you move out of this high region of myth into a slightly lower region of myth, into this realm of fantasy, But as this realm of fantasy goes on, they've set it up so that the last 2 or 3 stories start to happen like it's in this sort of out of time, or, you know, that feels like older time, but sort of this realm of fantasy, basically. And then you start having these stories that appear to be set in Dunsany's contemporary London, but that are sort of referencing back to some degree to these fantasy worlds, maybe moving in and out of them to some degree, or having fantasy elements. You know, it starts to move into that modern urban fantasy type thing, and we're going to see more of that in the next sections. But here in this section that's just fantasy, they put those stories right toward the end of that, and it just makes this incredible flow from the highest realms of nihilistic cosmic myth down into the fantastical, into the fantastical within the everyday, and then onward even further into that kind of realm, but more mixed. It's almost like, as we'll see from, it almost outlines what happens in, or the theme of The King of Elfland's Daughter, of the receding of fairy or myth, because you're moving out of those realms into the modern day. But sometimes, as I was looking through this, you could just dive down. I'm pretty sure you could dive down on any paragraph on any page in this book and get a mindful. Just be like, whoa, that's cool. You know, so I just jumped into this story, The Avenger of Perdonderus, and I just was suddenly plunged into this little fever dream. "Tea-bell," said the witch, and all the poets threw down their spades and followed her into the house, and I followed them. But the witch and all of us followed the black cat, who arched his back and lifted his tail and walked along the garden path of blue enameled tiles and through the black thatched porch and the open oaken door and into a little room where tea was ready. And in the garden the flowers began to sing, and the fountain tinkled on the disk of bronze. And I learned that the fountain came from an otherwise unknown sea, and sometimes it threw gilded fragments up from the wrecks of unheard-of galleons, foundered in storms of some sea that was nowhere in the world, or battered to bits in wars waged with we know not whom. Some said that it was salt because of the sea, and others that it was salt with mariners' tears. And some of the poets took large flowers out of vases and threw their petals all about the room, and others talked 2 at a time, and others sang. "Why, they are only children after all," I said. "Only children," repeated the witch, who was pouring out cowslip wine. "Only children," said the old black cat, and everyone laughed at me. "I sincerely apologize," I said. "I did not mean to say it. I did not intend to insult anyone." "Why, he knows nothing at all," said the old black cat, and everybody laughed till the poets were put to bed. What? This is the kind of fiction where reading the context of that will definitely make more sense of it, but will not remove that sense of mythic, mythopoeic dislocation, and how a scene like that still operates like a dream, where things are talking that shouldn't be talking, and you're apologizing for things you said, and you're not sure why people are laughing at you or whatever. And that's another thing about Dunsany, is he does a lot of really deep psychology through myth. He just lets his unconscious go to work, and you feel the stirrings in your psyche and how it's like trying to say things about who we are as people. Now, as I said, the next section is called Prose Poems. And this section comes just in time, because I had a great time reading this first part of the book when I first read it, and I did not find it, generally speaking, hard to get through, despite the fact that a lot of it is that like just big scope sort of myth and stuff. But by this point, there is some fatigue. There's some fantasy fatigue here. And this isn't a collection you need to read straight through. I think you can pick and choose, and that's absolutely fine, and you'll get a lot out of that. However, if you choose to read it through, as I've said, it's constructed in a way that it has a wonderful sort of thematic and maybe even emotional through line to it. But at this point, all this opulent fantasy, for me anyway, is starting to be like, whoa, I might need a break. But you open this next section, Prose Poems, and there's a story called Where the Tides Ebb and Flow. And it starts, "I dreamt that I had done a horrible thing, so that burial was to be denied me either in soil or sea. Neither could there be any hell for me." And I don't know, it just feels very different to me from that first sentence. I feel like we're getting slightly into Gothic territory, and the rest of the story bears that out, but still very Dunsanian fantasy territory at the same time, so quite cool. It goes on, I waited for some hours knowing this. Then my friends came for me and slew me secretly and with ancient rite, and lit great tapers and carried me away. It goes on. It was all in London that the thing was done, and they went furtively at dead of night along grey streets and among mean houses until they came to the river. And so you know that it's probably a modern setting, or it's at least enough into history that there's a London. And basically these people give him a shallow grave burial where he's actually still partly out of the ground. And it talks about how the tide, well, he's covered in mud except for his face, and the tide keeps coming in and washing over him, and he feels like, yes, my burial, and then it washes back out. And it's just like this powerful existential kind of pain or sorrow through this incredible metaphor. And basically he's dead at this point, and he's sort of a spirit, but he's tied to his body. He can't leave. And he can see the grim sort of houses and stuff along the river, and he wants to cry, he wants to weep, but he just can't. It's not possible for him in this state. And there are these tunnels by the river out of which rats come, and it says, the stealthy rats came down to nibble me away, and my soul rejoiced thereat, and believed that he would be free perforce from the accursed bones to which burial was refused. Very soon the rats ran away a little space and whispered among themselves. They never came any more. When I found that I was accursed, even among the rats, I tried to weep again. And of course he can't. But yeah, he's so accursed that the rats won't even eat him. And then from here, oh, such a cool thing. This is so Dunsany. And I do feel it feels like Dunsany meets Poe or something like that in a way. But what he does here is he basically does like the H.G. Wells time machine thing, where the time traveler goes so far into the future at this like fast speed that he just watches civilization fall and nature take things back over in the far future of Earth and stuff. And he's doing that as a dead spirit stuck with his bones. That he just becomes a set of bones that keep coming up to the ground, but then going back down and in again and stuff, partly buried. But he's able to witness until London just is no more. There's no more people. And he can tell that flowers and grass and animals and everything have just taken back over. And there's like mounds where there used to be warehouses. And he says, then I knew that the cause of nature had triumphed and London had passed away. And that's a very Dunsanian sentiment. Basically, these birds gather in large number. And like the rats talked amongst themselves, the birds talk amongst themselves and say, look, he's suffered enough. Let's be kind to him, they say. And he says, and at last I could see nothing but a host of flickering wings with the sunlight on them and little gaps of sky. Then, when there was nothing to be heard in London but the myriad notes of the exultant song, my soul rose up from the bones in the hole in the mud and began to climb up the song heavenwards. And it seemed that a laneway opened amongst the wings of the birds, and it went up, and one of the smaller gates of paradise stood ajar at the end of it. And then I knew by a sign that the mud should receive me no more, for suddenly I found that I could weep. And that is Dunsany matching his theme to his prose. To me, that is beautifully written, describing an incredible scene with an incredible emotional punch that he could finally weep, and that's how he knew. He's like, oh, I'm crying. I must be ascending finally. And again, that longing and poignancy, almost for something spiritual amidst a nihilistic worldview, although it reminds me a bit of Cormac McCarthy in that his earlier works are much more committedly nihilistic, it would seem. I don't think any of his stuff is purely nihilistic. Unlike authors like Dunsany and Lovecraft, McCarthy folds in other voices and just all this esoteric spirituality to kind of like thread with the nihilism to where you're not sure what's going on, and I think that's the point. But even in a more certain writer like Dunsany, there are these longings for some kind of transcendence. And lastly, he says, At this moment, I opened my eyes in bed in a house in London, and outside, some sparrows were twittering in a tree in the light of the radiant morning, and there were tears still wet upon my face, for one's restraint is feeble while one sleeps. He's like, I couldn't help crying, man. But I arose and opened the window wide, and stretching my hands out over the little garden, I blessed the birds whose song had woken me up from the troubled and terrible centuries of my dream. This is one of the best. This is one of the great short stories of literature, in my opinion, where the tides ebb and flow. And this, for me, this very short story was so engrossing that by the time he says he woke up, I had completely forgotten it was a dream. I thought we were in sort of some, a metaphysical tale that's just like, this is something that happened in this fantastical world. But it was a dream. Beautiful stuff. And so there's a host of other, well, not a host, a handful of other really short stories that are like little parables almost, like this one, but that are much shorter, like a page or half a page. And then it goes into this section called Fantasy and Reality. And here's where I feel it starts to get into urban fantasy, maybe magical realism adjacent. And I'm not going to get into it. I can't remember. I remember from this point onward feeling much more mixed. I didn't dislike anything. I enjoyed reading the whole thing, and it wasn't too hard to finish. But I began to have a sense of like, okay, that one really hit me, that one really didn't. Whereas before that, everything, even the ones I didn't love as much, were still like, whoa, this is so rich. Whereas here, it starts to be a little of a mixed bag for me. And it goes into a section called Jorkins, which apparently he wrote a whole bunch of these tales. And they're club tales. Chesterton did club tales. Those can be so fun. Just these guys getting together in a drawing room, having some drinks, and then one of them says, let me tell you a story, And some of these are better than others, I thought. But there is one of my favorites, one of my very favorites by Dunsany in this section. This is why it's worth like trying to read, the whole thing, because probably different things will hit you differently. But there's always these little surprises around the corner. You're like, oh, I didn't know he was going to do anything like this. But the one is called The Development of the Rilswood Estate. And basically he talks about how there's this Greek guy in town that has become really wealthy and successful and all these things. And basically what you find out is that he's a satyr from Greek mythology in modern times, like driving a car and stuff. It's great. I really loved it. And again, this one reminded me of like Lafferty, probably more so of like Neil Gaiman. And then the last section is called Some Late Tales. And again, I don't remember much about this section. I think again, it's got some really cool stuff and some stuff that didn't grab me as much. There is a famous story here, The Two Bottles of Relish, which when I saw that title, I was like, oh, that's supposed to be like a famous horror story or something. And so I looked at it, I didn't reread it, and I'm looking forward to rereading it to remember exactly what it happens. But by the end of the tale, you still don't know what's going on, and the narrator's going like, you should just stop reading at this point. You don't really want to know. This is icky stuff. And then he's like, okay, you want to go on? Fine. And then what he does is this thing is like, I only know what happened because I overheard somebody say something, and then I implied from that what happened. And then he says, here's what I overheard. And it's like, 3 words from one guy and 3 words from another. And then you have to like go back and go, oh, is that, and it, by our standards today, it's not the grossest, craziest thing, but it's pretty good. Yeah, it's got a little kick to it. And so that's this book. I recommend this so highly. And as a book, I guess maybe I would say it's a 9 out of 10 for me. And so let me just talk briefly then about this novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, published in 1924. So this is mid to late career, I'd say, of Dunsany. And here's the thing. Whilst I had enjoyed all that short fiction, I had this sense that the long fiction was going to be, naturally was going to feel the same in terms of prose from the short fiction. And I didn't feel that I would enjoy it at that length. And I should know better. I'm a great defender of Lafferty's novels, and everybody's like, oh, short stories are the best, don't bother with his novels. And I'm like, no, his novels are every bit as good as his short stories, sometimes better. Very much the case here. This is incredible. Doesn't help. I'm sorry, very sorry, but I hate the fantasy masterworks and science fiction masterworks series in terms of the artistry of it. The covers are atrocious. This cover gives you no idea of what this story is about, and in fact leads you very down the wrong road. It is not about knightly romance and that sort of thing. Spoiler. Skip ahead a few seconds if you haven't read this. On the cover should be a guy holding a bloodied warrior holding a decapitated unicorn's head. No, that would give too much away. And that's not a plot point giveaway. It's just a development of events that you want to see happen. Anyway, at some point I picked this up and I noticed for the first time that Neil Gaiman had an intro to it, which intrigued me, and I read it and intrigued me more. And I was like, I think I want to read this. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Neil Gaiman's work. Probably the one book that I've truly liked by him was Anansi Boys, but I've read quite a few others, and he's always got some cool thing going on. He's definitely pretty good. And though he seems to write endorsements for all kinds of people, generally I've found him pretty sound when he writes about Lovecraft or Gene Wolfe or R.A. Lafferty, etc. So I kind of trust his opinion about a lot of this kind of stuff. And again, he was right about Dunsany. That's kind of Neil Gaiman's role to me. He is a curator of fantastical literature that came before him, both in terms of his promotion and really what he weaves into his own work. And that's a very cool role. What this book is about is the receding of Faerie from the advancing modern world. This geographical diminishing of the possibility of Faerie, of enchantment, of a magical world and reality. And it is elegiac and poignant as hell. One of the most poignant books I've ever read. It is unlike any fantasy that I've read. The closest thing to it, actually, is George MacDonald. Kind of surprisingly, maybe. Maybe not. I mean, Tolkien himself is almost a fusion of George MacDonald and Lord Dunsany and then other things in his own thing, but those are two of his main influences. And while I think they are completely different authors with just completely different, almost tones and certainly worldviews, they overlap a lot in ways that I would have to, outline elsewhere after I think about it some more. But I can't help but wonder if they have a Celtic thing in common, MacDonald being Scottish and Dunsany being Irish, and both drawing on the Faerie and so on from their respective countries, and both being very, very, very inventive about that, and both having just such a strong vision of life. And though MacDonald has a devoutly religious worldview, it is almost notoriously amongst Christians a very complicated one, and one in which we, like in Dunsany's, exists within a vastness and intricacy that challenges our finitude to arise to the occasion. And I'll certainly do a separate video on MacDonald at some point. But if you want to try him out, I highly recommend just jumping into the fairy tales, particularly read The Golden Key. For me, that might be the main one where you might find the most immediate, strange resonance with Dunsany. Very, very different, but somehow connecting at some deep level for me. But if you want to jump in with MacDonald full tilt and the full immersive experience at novel length, you could try his early fantasy novel called Fantasts, or his later one called Lilith. I found these awesome kind of pulpy covers for cheap somewhere sometime from Ballantine, with cover art by Gervasio Gallardo. And there's quotes and maybe some introductions and things. These are introed by Lynn Carter, these editions. But there's quotes not only from Lewis and Tolkien, who were massively influenced by him, but W.H. Auden actually saw something great in MacDonald, and in this strange way compared him to Poe, which is a cool connection. And that's the thing, is these are like richly fairy, fantastical, and often, well, in the fairy tales, it's just pure, it kind of moves around, but a lot of it's pure fairy tale, fantastical realm sort of stuff, but some of it moves in and out of more modern times. But these massively move like from a modern setting into Faerie in really cool ways. But his fiction, including the sort of famous, what we would now call YA fiction, like The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and Curdie, his fiction has a lot of monsters and semi-horrific moments in a fairy tale sort of manner that's not overtly horror, but definitely has that tinge. And I think there's a lot of people in the weird fiction and community and stuff like that that maybe haven't checked out McDonald, and I really think you're missing out. It's weird. It's properly weird. It has some of the best monster theory stuff I've ever encountered. It can range in and out of some sermonizing, but as I said, his sermonizing is complicated and interesting, and there's not like a ton of overt stuff like that. But he's a bit of a metaphysician, I'd say. These are the editions you'd be more likely to run into, which I do kind of enjoy these covers. I think they're super cheesy, but kind of fun. But perhaps, I guess, in the theme and purview of The King of the Elfland's Daughter, you would more naturally see a connection with MacDonald. But basically, I think a prince has to go and marry a princess from Faerie, and there's these borders on the Kingdom of Twilight by which you can cross into Faerie. And I can't remember the details. I believe they have a son together, and there's partings and separations and different things that I can't remember, but all adds to the poignancy and all about these borders and boundaries, receding, advancing, crossings. There's a witch toward the beginning gathering thunderbolts, which is really cool. And whilst it has that same compact, mythic fairy tale quality of the short fiction at length, which I would have thought wouldn't work, because it's just not detailed like a novel usually is. But it holds together super well, and I just found it completely page-turning. It was no problem to read. It was very enjoyable. Definitely very mythic, kind of like living in a dream for a little while. Glancing through, I think there's like any number of lovely wonders within it. But the thing I remember, and this is just very me to have latched onto this, is that there's this whole section halfway through the book where Faerie has receded very far, and some people, there's a whole, like, there's a religious, in fact, I think specifically Christian community that is helping to push these boundaries back. And there's a bitterness in Dunsany about that that is super relatable. This is not the kind of thing that you so often see where you need some baddies, so you make some kind of culty Christian people. This is something Dunsany felt in his bones. And this is coming at almost a symbolic level, not in cheap symbolism, but like deep symbols of Dunsany just witnessing and feeling the impact that the modern world has had. And his enemies are modern materialism and scientism and Christianity, and how they've diminished an enchanted world for him, and indeed persecuted people in their domination. It's very effective as a book on that level as well, and it's all part of the poignancy and the power of it. And yet, as I've said, there is this spiritual longing within it that is profound. Anyway, unicorns show up, or a unicorn shows up. And this is an event. Everybody's just like, oh, a harbinger of Faerie is amongst us. And this goes on for chapters, the sighting and the implications. And what do they do in response? This prince sets up a hunting party to hunt the unicorn with hounds, like a fox hunt. What is going on psychologically here that the thing you've longed for spiritually has showed up in an epiphany, and your response is to hunt it down brutally, as we'll see. But I mean, that is the language of longing, and lots of classical literature that what the heart is after is a quarry, a thing that it's hunting down. And kind of a cool image here. Cattle leaped up from their sleep, gazed dreamily and wondered. But the unicorn went through them and away, as some rose-scented breeze that has strayed from valley gardens into the streets of a city slips through the noisy traffic and is gone. And it says that oftentimes, like on a fox hunt, the smell of sheep or cattle will kind of interfere with what the hounds are trying to do, chasing the fox. But this unicorn was the only magical thing in all our field that night, and his scent lay unmistakable over the earthly grass, a burning, pungent flavor of enchantment among the things of every day. Good stuff. and a Dunsanian sentiment. So they chase the unicorn. The hounds get it at bay. It's fending them off with its horn. The hunter's going to shoot an arrow, decides that's not fair, so draws a sword and basically has a sword fight with the unicorn and sword. It's a cool little scene. He can't get to it, but he's worn it out, and the dogs are finally able to leap up and attack it and latch onto it with their teeth and bring it down. And as they're tearing its throat, awful groans came from the unicorn, such sounds as are not heard in the fields we know. And then there was no sound but the deep growl of the hounds that roared over the wonderful carcass as they wallowed in fabulous blood. They roared over the wonderful carcass as they wallowed in fabulous blood, meaning fabulous, like of fable, fantastical, magical blood. End of chapter. Next chapter starts. The guy, the hunter, draws his sword casually, walks up and lops the unicorn's head off. When he's cut the unicorn's head off, it says that he also took the skin of the long white neck and brought it away, dangling empty from the head. And then, at last, he had it slung by a leather thong over his shoulders, the great horn pointing upwards past the right side of his head, and the smeared skin hanging down along his back. And while he arranged it thus, he allowed his hounds to worry the body again and taste that wonderful blood. It says after he and the hounds take off, the foxes that had been waiting around come and get what's left of the unicorn. That is one of the coolest things I have ever read in fantasy. And disturbing. And why? And how does this fit with their longing for Faerie? And I think it does. I think there are kind of deep psychological things going on here. As I seem to recall from here, they actually start hunting unicorns. They like lure them across the border of Faerie, and they start hunting multiple unicorns. And other stuff happens. And I don't remember what it is. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Both of these books, I'm realizing looking into them again, and I always wanted to revisit them, but now I'm like, oh man, I have to reread this stuff. I need to find a way to make it a point to reread this stuff. Maybe I'll have a reason to write about it. No, that'll be why. And there's just many other emblematized evocations or evoked emblems of this whole divide between ourselves and the enchanted world that once was or continues on in corners. And there's this really poignant moment where the son of the human and the fairy woman is calling across the border into Faerie toward his mother and not getting a response. Wow. This is just waiting for psychological analysis. So there you have it, Forgotten Bookshelf, episode 1 on Lord Dunsany. A hot take, for sure, but that's what these are meant to be. I hope with some substance, and that will promote further discussion. And again, in addition to asking me to cover certain things for Forgotten Bookshelf, if you see stuff on my shelf you want me to cover, you can also request that I do more than just like, oh, here's what I remember and here's a few dips, and like actually do a video on a book having reread it. So thank you very much for being a supporter, a Patreon supporter here, and I hope you're enjoying the subscriber content. And please let me know what you'd like to see. Bye.